Greetings, comrades, friends, and peace-loving people throughout the world. My name is Mbali Ngwenda with Pan-Africanism Today in South Africa. We are excited and honored to welcome you to the first part of our public education series, that being Apartheid and Land, from South Africa to Palestine. Comrades, coming off the back of a successful Dilemmas of Humanity conference held in Johannesburg last month, the question of Palestine came out very strongly amongst a myriad of tactical issues for the working class and its organizations. As comrades had stated quite eloquently, that the dilemmas of humanity have reached an inflection point. As we discuss what it means to be a human being in the 21st century, we cannot ignore the resistance and unbreakable spirit of the Palestinian people and the fight for national liberation and self-determination on the land of their forefathers. Comrades, currently over 11,000 people have been killed on the Gaza Strip since last October. At this rate of slaughter, over 30,000 people will have been killed by Christmas this year, 40% being children and 30% being women. Comrades, on the African continent, we are clear that Israel is a colonial occupation today, as it was during its inception in the 1940s. The racist and fascist apartheid regime under the Nationalist Party was never hostile towards the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In fact, we can see in many ways that the brutality of apartheid is heavily embodied by Netanyahu and his scavengers, living off the blood of the Palestinian people, by raiding Palestinian homes, by exterminating women and children, and not allowing indigenous Palestinians the right to come back home without conditions. The fascists in Tel Aviv, since revoking work permits for Palestinian workers, have almost doubled the rate of arrests in less than a month, exceeding the 10,000 mark. The youngest being arrested, only 12 years old of age. We exclaim that you can never succeed in trying to criminalize workers, the working people, the broader working class, and its organizations. Comrades, in opening this important conversation, we would like to welcome Comrade Jonis Ghedi-Alasow, who is a coordinator of the Pan-Africanism Today Secretariat, who will then unpack a lot of the key and critical aspects of this subject today. Welcome, Comrade Jonis. Thank you so much for making time to be with us. We are quite happy to have you, and we hope that we will have a fruitful conversation with you today. Welcome, Comrade.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Perhaps I can start by thanking Comrade Mbali, by appreciating all the people that are making time to participate in this very important discussion. I think it's almost impossible to start a conversation like this without expressing unconditional solidarity with the legitimate struggles of the Palestinian people to have some dignity, some land, and some humanity in the land of their ancestors, and to say that we have no qualms with everyone coexisting peacefully, but people such as the right-wing government of Israel wanting to exist by absolutely displacing the Palestinian, not just from their land, but based on what we've seen in recent weeks, from the face of this earth. There has to be an absolute outcry against this. So I want to do a couple of things as I give a few inputs in this important discussion, not because they are conclusive, but because it's important for us to appreciate the kind of trajectory that we are on. Because ultimately the purpose for a conversation like this one is to sharpen our ability to bring about long-lasting and permanent freedom for the Palestinian people who are suffering under a colonial and brutal regime of Zionist Israel. So I want to do three things. One is I want to basically situate and not purely because we think that this is an interesting experiment, but because we think that there are important parallels between the colonial project as it was experienced on the African continent generally, in South Africa specifically, and what we are witnessing today in the brutality with which the Palestinian people are being treated. The second point that I want to kind of elaborate on a little bit is about the ways in which we need to understand that particular experience. Colonialism has manifested in many ways in many parts of the world. So I want to spend a few minutes on the colonialism that we are witnessing in historic Palestine. And then thirdly, it's the important question of what does it mean to liberate yourself from colonialism? Because I'm going to argue that that's what the Palestinian people are concerned with. This is not about one religion against another. This is not about the kind of right of one group to exist as opposed to another. This is a question about colonial occupation versus anti-colonial struggle. So let me start with the first one, which is, as we know, many of us who are watching this important webinar are from the African continent, which has had an experience of colonialism in one way or another. And it has manifested in different ways, but really what it all had in common was about the one group. Usually in our case, in our experience, it was set people coming from Europe. As capitalism develops in Europe, people are getting wealthy enough to start exploiting beyond their own national borders in this case, Western Europe, and they start exploiting people in other parts of the world. So the colonial project and the period of colonialism, whether it's in Africa, Asia, Latin America, was about people coming and saying that we are going to take your resources. And I think it's important to remember that colonialism spread through the barrel of the gun. Of course, there was also negotiations, there was legitimation through religion, there was all kinds of other ways in which colonialism managed to secure its foothold. But at the end of the day, when Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652 in South Africa, or when the first slave ships started to travel past the West African coast, they were armed, and they were bringing with them the brutality that we came to see over the last few centuries. And there was always different kinds of resources that were taken throughout this period. And I know I'm grouping a lot of things together, but what we are talking about is there was labor taken, there was natural resources taken. In some cases, we became the site for all kinds of production. I mean, it's not an accident that there was a point where Zimbabwe was the largest producer of tobacco in the world, but tobacco is not something that the Zimbabwean people were able to eat. So this experience of colonialism. Now, I want to shift a little bit to a very specific kind of colonialism, because in many parts, this was an issue of asserting yourself on a country and trying to take its resources, but not necessarily situating yourself there. There are some exceptions here, and this is what we call settler colonies. And here is where the South African experience is significant, because we have had people who settled themselves here. In other words, the colonizer was living side by side with the colonized. So to summarize, the question of colonialism is really just a question of trying to exploit the people outside of where one is originally from. Now, that exploitation can take different forms, but ultimately, that's what's at its core it's about. But there are certain manifestations that are perhaps, let's say, a bit unique. And this is what I want to come to, which is this question of settler colonialism. Because countries like South Africa, like Zimbabwe, like Kenya, are countries where the colonizer didn't merely come with guns. They also settled in the colony. And you ended up with a situation where that process of exploitation, of oppression, of asserting yourself as the beneficiary of the wealth of that country was taking place, where the colonizer and the colonized are living side by side with one another. Now, I think there's one important distinction that I want to make that in relation to these examples that I mentioned. Because whereas, of course, at the core of this, it was about wealth, there was in the case of South Africa, in the case of Zimbabwe, in the case of Kenya, there was a recognition that the ability to extract the wealth of that country, the colonizers' ability to actually become wealthy, was dependent on not just the exploitation of the land and the natural resources, but also the people that live there. So this is the context in which people like Sol Plaatje say that when they explain the 1913 Land Act, Sol Plaatje says that he's the first general secretary of the ANC. He writes this book in the wake of the 1913 Land Act in South Africa. But in that, the kind of opening line of the book is about a point that very sharply raises this contradiction, where the native on the 13th of July, 1913, became a pariah in the land of their birth. In other words, they were shifted off the land. They became non-citizens in the land where they come from. But they were shifted off into reserves in order to then form part of the migrant labor system that created the conditions where 50% of the gold that has ever been extracted on planet Earth was extracted from the Witwatersrand in South Africa by this African labor that was taken off their land by force. And this is just one example, because again, if we speak a lot about the resistance in Kenya and about the kind of struggle against colonialism, many people know the name of Jomo Kenyatta. But what people don't talk a lot about is that there was an army that was fighting an armed struggle against colonialism. Now, it is colloquially known as the Mau Mau, but the name of that army, which here there's a soldier represented, this was the Land and Freedom Army. In other words, the question of fighting for land and fighting for freedom is at the heart of the way in which the resistance to colonialism unfolded in many parts of the continent. And even in a case like Zimbabwe, the land question is still at the center of what we understand there, even though there was a kind of so-called peaceful transition in 1980. In 1999 to the early 2000s, there was a popular bottom-up land reform process that was then endorsed by the government. So the question of who gets to own and control the land and who gets to have a say about how labor is being organized in the country is at the heart of this question in these settler colonies. Now, I want to make a distinction between that kind of settler colonialism and what we are today seeing in Israel, which actually isn't trying to follow the path that was taken by the fascists in South Africa or by the colonizers of Zimbabwe or by the settlers in Kenya. This, because the distinction is that in these cases, the labor of the native population was central to the project of exploitation. Whereas in countries like Australia, in countries like the United States, in countries like Canada, all of which were also settler colonies, it wasn't a project of trying to exploit the labor of the people. It was about taking the land and exterminating the people that lived there. Today, where is the indigenous population of the US? Where is the indigenous population of Australia? These are minority small groups, if they still exist, and there was an enormous project, a conscious project, to rid the land of the people. Now, I think this is the part that's important when we try to understand what's going on in Palestine, because we need to remember Palestine is a country or a people that has actually been living under colonization for centuries. It was the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire fell in the late 19th century, then it became the British Empire. The British Empire in 1917, through the Balfour Declaration, promised the land of the Palestinian people to the emerging Zionist groups that were developing in Europe. So 1948, which is when the country of Israel comes into existence for the first time, incidentally, it comes into existence in the same month as the apartheid state led by the National Party in South Africa comes into existence. Again, in the wake of the Second World War, in a period where the whole world is in turmoil, we see this rise of these extreme fascist, violent, brutal regimes coming into power. But it's important to remember that they come into a power on land that doesn't belong to them and over people who are in effect the people who are the original inhabitants of that land. And whilst they have very similar ideologies in terms of their views of their own superiority, they legitimate their colonialism through religious ideas. They are brutal and racist towards the people, the indigenous population. This is absolutely what they have in common between Palestine, historic Palestine, what then became Israel in 1948 and later in 1967, and what we saw in South Africa from 1948 up until the democratic breakthrough in South Africa in 1994. What is unique, what they have in common is absolutely their brutality, their racism, etc. But it's important to remember that when we are talking about Israel, we are talking about a country that wants to exist at the expense of Palestine. This is not simply about colonizing. This is about displacing. So people have been displaced in the Nakba from their homes. But even before then, we started seeing huge amounts of money being invested into doing simple things like renaming cities. The Arabic names of cities was changed to Hebrew names. The ability that again, a similarity many of us understand on the continent. Palestinian people were asked, where's the title deed for your land? If you cannot produce a title deed, then you are deemed to not own the land. Until today, where land is not Palestinian land, even in Gaza and the West Bank, when the Palestinian people who have lived there for generations are not able to produce a title deed, then they are told, sorry, this land does not belong to you, and it is national land. In other words, the burden is on the indigenous, original inhabitant of the land to, under the laws of the colonizer, to try and explain that they have a legitimate claim to the land. Now, we know this, how we were ourselves told that unless you live in a certain kind of house under colonialism, you need to pay taxes. Unless you are able to produce legal documents that the land belongs to you, it is considered to be empty land. And there's a long history of this, not just in Africa, but in Latin America as well. But the point is that it is important to kind of appreciate these nuances. But the thing that is also central to this kind of project of trying to remove people of their land is ultimately a question of what does it mean to fight back against this? Because we know that no one accepts exploitation and oppression as though this is a kind of God-given reality. We know that the exploitation, the oppression that many people suffer and continue to suffer all over the world is something that is on day one is met with resistance. So the Palestinian resistance is a long resistance, and it's a resistance that makes very simple demands. A demand that says the land that our ancestors were come from, regardless of race, regardless of religion. This is a land that we cannot just give up for the purposes of a colonial project. Now, this is not a very complicated demand, and therefore what we are confronted with in Palestine is a question of national liberation. Now, there are many examples of this, and they have taken many forms. And throughout the African continent, we have a long history of people fighting for national liberation, of saying that we want to be able to control the country of our birth, we want to benefit from its wealth, and we want to be able to slowly and systematically be able to determine our own future. Now, the future for the Palestinian people that is being determined by Israel is a future of non-existence. We saw now they are bombing hospitals and killing the children inside and telling their parents to move south. Move south, who knows where that is? Where is south when you're home, when you're being told to just vacate your home? This is the Nakba that started in 1948 and has effectively continued every single day since then, is being intensified today. The catastrophe of people being displaced from their homes, of Israel artificially creating a state where they are in the majority, where they control all political power, all military power, all economic power, is a conscious project that was built on the bones of the Palestinian people that are being forced into either exile or death by this extremely brutal project. Now, one form in which the Palestinian people have organized themselves, they have organized themselves politically, they've organized themselves to some extent economically, socially, but even militarily. Now, we know that that has been a very complex question. How successful it will be, we don't know. but it is important to appreciate the resistance of the Palestinian people, number one. Number two, it's important because it's not because that's how history moves. History moves because even in the face of the adversity and the violence that we are confronted with when it comes to the Zionist project in Israel, we are also able to say that when the people come together and they organize themselves under a legitimate cause of national independence, of self-determination, of anti-colonial struggle, that is a legitimate call for them to make. And this is something that people have made all over the world, because even in countries like we are seeing the work of Julius Nyerere, there was a fight to try and gain independence. And even once independence was gained, it was a struggle to try and keep that independence. And that's true in many parts of the world. But one thing that is important about Tanzania, what is important about all anti-colonial struggles, is that they don't only unfold within the borders of the country that is being colonized. The colonization of one group means that it is a smidge on the dignity of all humanity. And this is what we have seen throughout history. We know that it is not only the South African people that fought against apartheid. It is the people from all over the world who said that this brutality has to end. And that, yes, we are confronted by a special kind of colonialism, a special kind of exploitation. It's not necessary. We're not saying that the people that the people who are currently living here cannot live here. But what we are saying is that a small minority cannot continue to live, exist, and flourish at the expense of the majority. And this is the distinction between what we have come to appreciate as the need to fight against colonialism. In South Africa, there was mass mobilization, there was armed struggle, there was all kinds of pillars of the struggle against apartheid. And this is what we are seeing throughout the world. It is historic that tens of thousands of people are waving Palestinian flags throughout the world. I think it is important for us as members of organizations, and I'll end here, to appreciate the interconnectedness of the struggles we are waging in the day-to-day. If I am a peasant who's fighting against land grabs in my country, or I'm a trade unionist who's fighting against exploitation on the shop floor, what I am confronted is with the legacy of colonialism, with the consequences of capitalism, with the reality that they are always a small group of people who want to yield power in order to oppress and exploit. And the fight against land grabs, the fight against exploitation in the workplace, the fight against all kinds of social ills that we are confronted by, is a fight against precisely this kind of exploitation. And I would argue that on the planet today, there is no better point where this question is being contested than in Palestine. And I don't mean historic Palestine. I mean the spirit of Palestine. Because the spirit of Palestine, these kufiyas are being worn all over the world. The Palestinian flag is being flown in streets throughout the world. Now, we might say that's merely symbolic, but I think it's a call to action, not only for things like a ceasefire, for things like the withdrawal of Israel from the Palestinian territories, but it is also a demand for the colonial project to be brought to an end. And that colonial project that must be brought to an end in Palestine is the same colonial project, the same capitalist project that we are fighting against in our respective sites of struggle. So there's an important need for us to go beyond not just endorsing and supporting the symbolic actions of standing with Palestine, but also saying that we appreciate that there is a direct connection between what we are fighting against in our own sites of struggle and the weakest link of the chain of imperialism that we are seeing today, which is sitting in Gaza as we speak. So let me pause there. Thank you very much, Comrade Bali.
Thank you so much, Comrade Jonis, for that very comprehensive outlook in terms of the struggle that's going on now with the Palestinian people. And also grounding us, Comrade, around this question as Africans on the continent who are trying to better understand the context that is going on there, and also trying to make that connection between what we are struggling with here on the continent and what is actually going on in Palestine. So thank you so much for that grounding, Comrade. And just to quickly just like sort of summarize that you really did, you did put forward the notion that in order to really fight what is happening there in Palestine, we cannot want to take up the question of internationalism. This is one of the most important tools, and I think you've mentioned that so well, comrade. And I think if there's anything that we can really try and take away right now as organizations within the African continent is this particular tool, how it is being used, and how we must harness that in the fight, not just here on the continent, but for the Palestinian people, towards their national liberation. But thank you so much, Comrade Jonis. And I think anyone who is listening here would have taken quite a lot from what you have said. But comrades, in just trying to then close the session, because I think we have really touched on a lot of the holistic points that were needed, in just trying to conclude it, comrade, is that as revolutionary organizations, we are saying that there is no replacement for organizing ourselves and being able to resist imperialist hegemony. As peasants and as the industrial proletariat, we also understand that a people's relationship with the land is not only about subsistence or a decent shelter. Land also carries the collective historical background of a people, the political culture of resistance and victory. Comrades, we will not and we cannot rest until we defeat capitalism and imperialism, be it in Palestine, be it in Swaziland, be it in Venezuela, be it in Cuba or Western Sahara. With these last few words, comrades, one must say, I have never wanted to spare myself because I feel there are people who are no longer around and died for this struggle. What right do I have to hold back, to rest, to preserve my health, to have time with my family when there are other people who are no longer alive, when they have sacrificed what is precious, namely life itself? Comrades, these are the words of Comrade Krizan. With that having been said, thank you so much for joining us on this first part of our public education series. We look forward to you joining us on this journey and continuing with these critical conversations and actually expanding on some of the discussions and debates that have unfolded here today, and continuing with these discussions in our communities, in our revolutionary spaces, in our workplaces, where we find each other, comrades. So thank you so much for joining us, and please continue to join us as we continue with this series. Thank you so much, comrades.